I'm Jeff Blumenfeld. I'm chairman of the Rocky Mountain chapter of the Explorers Club. It's February 22nd, 2022. So it's 2/22/22. I can't say that until it's 3/3/33 in 11 years. Welcome to one of our Zoom calls. Hopefully at some point we'll be able to meet in person, and I'll go over the schedule shortly. Just a couple of things. If you are a member and you are planning to go to the Explorers Club annual dinner on April 23rd, please let me know. I will not be going, but I will be participating in a chapter meeting that they'll have both live and by Zoom from the club itself. A few months ago, we were quite pleased to have as a guest speaker George Fransden. George Fransden has the unique unique claim of being the world's greatest coprolite authority. And this is a coprolite, which my grandson loves, and he doesn't call it a coprolite, he calls it what it really is, and that's dinosaur poop. So tonight at 8 o'clock Mountain Time, and I assume 8 o'clock Pacific Time, George is on the classic TV show To Tell the Truth. We'll try to get a clip for that and post it to Facebook. Coming up, we have a talk on March 29th with Dylan Taylor. He flew aboard, he was on Blue Origin's New Shepard. He claims he was the 606th human to enter space. He'll discuss his experience on that space flight, as well as what the future holds for human space flight and exploration. And that'll be March 29th. Perhaps we'll be able to do that live. Then April 29th, Ellen Ornett will be speaking to us, hopefully live in Boulder. Ellen climbs, coaches, he talks, he writes, and he's an authority on Everest and has a blog about the history of Everest and current climbs. And that's April 29th with Ellen Ornett. Then on May 25, James Balog, photographer of great acclaim. He also photographed a video, he was a videographer for Chasing Ice and the Human Element, and he's coming to talk to us on May 25th. And then on June 8th, very pleased to have a presentation by Ricardo Pena. Ricardo is an authority on Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, also known as the Miracle Flight 571, which is the subject of the book Alive. Ricardo went to the crash site. He found a jacket that had never been seen before. In the jacket was a driver's license. He traced it back down to one of the survivors from that flight from 1972, and they become fast friends. And it's a fabulous story that he's going to be able to share with us for that presentation. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Rick Ridgeway. We were supposed to see Rick live and in person. We have to see him on Memorex. We were going to see him live at the Boulder Patagonia store, but we got COVIDed out. And we're glad that Rick could carve some time out for us. And I want to thank Stephanie Ridge of Wild Ridge PR for lining up this talk for us. Rick will be talking about his book, Life Lived Wild. And let me tell you a little bit about Rick, who I met in the 80s when I did some work with Will Steger. Rick is an outdoor adventurer, a writer, and an advocate for sustainability and conservation initiatives. For 15 years, Rick was the VP of Environmental Affairs and then VP of Public Engagement at Patagonia. And during that time, he worked with teams to develop and launch environmental and sustainability initiatives. In addition, he's recognized as one of the world's foremost mountaineers. With 3 companions, he was the first American to summit K2, and he's done other significant climbs and explorations on all continents. And he's written 7 books, magazine stories, and produced and directed dozens of TV shows. National Geographic honored him with his Lifetime Achievement in Adventure Award. In conservation, he serves on the boards of the Tompkins Conservation, the Turtle Conservancy, One Earth, and the Kiewit Family Foundation. Rick lives in, I'm going to say this wrong, Ojawa,
Oh, hi.
Oh, hi, California. You see, I've rehearsed.
Oh, hi.
Oh, hi. And as 3 children and 4 grandchildren, we're all looking forward to learning more about a life lived wild. Rick, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff, and great to be here with all of you guys. As he said, I'm sorry I couldn't be in person, although Patagonia, who published my memoir, Life Lived Wild, that came out in November, is considering reprising that tour. And if they do, I may get out to Boulder, and the most likely date would be sometime in May. So even though I'll probably be giving a show very similar to the one you're going to see right now, it might be fun if you could make it out for the in-person thing. Always a pleasure to meet everybody in the flesh and instead of on the screen. I know in talking about books, authors most commonly read passages, but I've been a photographer and a filmmaker, as Jeff said, as well as a writer. So I thought I'd give you guys a kind of an old-fashioned slideshow this evening. Although it is a little bit new school instead of totally old school, because I have a few video clips embedded into it as well. And it's a slideshow that reviews my life as an adventure. The same, a lot of the stories that are in the book, but they don't track the book exactly. I decided I would, make it a companion to the book instead of just a direct reflection of it. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. I got Jeffrey here to help me if I do anything wrong, but we've been through this. So Jeffrey, bear with me here and we'll do the share thing. I'm going to press play on my keynote and I'm going to go back to the beginning. There we go. And before I start, I would just want to check Jeffrey and ask if we're looking good.
Yep, looking good. Go for it.
Okay, well, I am going to actually read one section from the book. It's from the prologue to get us started, where I wrote that I once calculated that I have spent over 5 years total time sleeping in tents, and most of that in small tents pitched in the world's most remote regions. And I say that not to boast, but to offer it as a measure of time spent deeply connected to wildness, because that connection has shaped the way I've lived my life, teaching me to distinguish what I call matters of consequence from matters of inconsequence. And I'm assuming all of you here tonight could benefit from knowing better how to separate things that are consequential from things that aren't. And if you think about it, you might come to the same conclusion I have, that it's probably about as important of a life skill as any of us could own. And I'm not claiming by any means that I've got it figured out, but I'm on a journey just like everybody here this evening. And it's a journey that started when I was a young teenager, and my mother gave me a subscription to National Geographic, and I read the cover story about the first American ascent of Everest. And you guys will remember that was back in 1963. And inside the magazine, there was this photo of Jim Whittaker, the first American to reach the top. And when I saw that, I just decided that's what I wanted to do. So I bought an ice axe and some crampons, just like Whittaker's, and I got this instruction book about how to use my new gear, and that kind of set my mother's maternal radar bleeping. So for my high school graduation present, she sent me to Outward Bound in the Oregon Cascades, where I did learn some basic mountaineering and climbing skills, and I came back from that more hooked than ever. And after college, I used every dollar I could earn doing odd jobs to climb in places like Yosemite. And I also started going to Peru, where I learned the fundamentals of high altitude mountaineering. And there I met another climber that was more experienced than me, a guy named Chris Chandler. And Chris took me under his wing. And about 2 years later, he called and said, "Hey, I got both of us on an expedition to the Himalayas." And I said, "The Himalayas," because that had been my dream. I had no idea how to get there, but I said, "What's the peak?" And he hesitated for a minute, and then he said, "It's Everest." I remembered that National Geographic article I'd read when I was in my early teens, and that photo of my hero, Jim Whittaker, on the summit. And here I was at age 25, following his footsteps. And the expedition was filmed for a television special, and the camera crew followed Chris and me through the Khumbu ice fall that, as you guys know, is the most dangerous part of the climb. And today Sherpas, of course, put the route in for clients that can, pay over $100,000 to say they've climbed Everest. But back then we had to figure it out for ourselves every step of the way.
1247, September 2nd. In only 4 days, they have built a route through the ice fall where it has taken some expeditions weeks. But the top of the ice fall is hardly the summit of Mount Everest.
And for the next 3 weeks, we made good progress. And a week after that, I was on my way to the top. But then just below the 8,000 meter level, the 26,000 foot mark, my lungs congested, and I didn't have any choice but to go down. But my climbing partner, Chris, went on to reach the top, climbing in hurricane winds. And with that success, the expedition was over, and we started the long journey home down the mountain. And I wondered if I had it in me to be a high altitude mountaineer. And if I tried another big mountain, would I have the same issue with my lungs? And if I did, would I be less lucky and even survive it? Well, then I had a chance to find out about a year later when I got a call from Jim Whitaker, my boyhood hero. And Jim was putting together an expedition to K2, the second highest peak on the planet. And today, as probably most of you guys know, it's regarded as the hardest high altitude mountain in the world to climb. And when I finally learned that, my first thought was that it was a really good thing that we didn't know that back then. But back then, even the trek to base camp was hard. It was 110 miles with over 450 porters carrying our supplies for the nearly 4 months the trek and the climb took. And after a couple of weeks, we rounded a corner, and there it was rising in the background, K2, like this gigantic four-sided pyramid. And we started trekking up the glacier, and that fear I had on Everest came back. And I remembered my lungs getting congested, and I felt that uncertainty, not knowing if it was going to happen again. And even if I stayed healthy, there was just the mountain itself. So we set up our base camp, and the weather held, and we started up. There were 14 of us on the team, and unlike Everest, on this one, there were no Sherpas to help us. We set up camp 1 and 2, and some of the team carried supplies while others pushed the route further up the mountain. And we were now ready to tackle this, the knife edge, a ridge almost a mile long that had an average elevation of about 23,000 feet. But we only managed to get started when the weather turned. And at first we stayed in our hike camp hoping that the storm was going to be short, but we were using food and fuel that we worked really hard to carry up. So after 4 days, we didn't have any choice but to go all the way back down to base camp. And the storm lasted another week. And when it cleared, we had to work hard to get back to our previous high point. And then finally, we were ready to cross the knife edge, which was also the precise border between Pakistan and China. And it took 4 days to get to the other end, fixing ropes and putting a pretty tough route in. And then there was no obvious place on the other end to set up camp. So we didn't have any choice but to take our ice axes and hack off the top of the ridge to make platforms for our tents. And now we were ready to push up to the next camp, Camp 5. But before we could even get started, the next storm hit. And again, we didn't have any choice but to rappel all the way down to base camp. And this one lasted about another week, about 7 days. And when it finally cleared, we climbed back up the ropes, and it took 3 or 4 days to dig out all the tents. And now looking up, we still had the summit head wall in front of us, and timbers were getting thin, and so was the food supply. And we'd been on the mountain at this point for over a month, about 5 or 6 weeks. And we pushed up to the next camp at 25,000 feet. We only got there, and another storm hit. And once again, all the way back down to base camp. And once again, it lasted about another week. And every day I had to struggle to safeguard my optimism and commitment. But finally it cleared, and there were 4 of us who were picked to make an 11th hour attempt on the top. and we were just about out of food and supplies, hardly anything left. So we put in one more camp at the 8,000 meter level at 26,000 feet. And then the next day, the weather held, but the climbing was hard, including one section at about 27,000 feet where we had to climb steep rock covered with ice. And there were four of us on the summit push, and my partner and I, John Roskelley, and I were following these two guys, but we left our anchors behind. And with that, we also left our rope. So we actually climbed this section unroped. And we also climbed it without oxygen. Nobody had ever done that before. But every step took this concentrated effort. But then finally in the mid-afternoon, I got to the summit on just a perfect summit day. That's me resting on a rock that's just about 20 feet below the top. I think it's buried in snow now, but it was a good place to try to catch my breath, because all I could think about was really how I was going to get down alive. And in fact, the descent did take about 5 days, and getting into the 25,000 foot camp, there was a little uphill section to get back to the camp. And I remember I just couldn't do it. I finally had to drop down on my hands and knees. I crawled the last 50 feet into the tent. And finally we got back to base camp, and we were greeted by our buddies. And at this point, we'd been above 18,000 feet for 68 days in a row. And man, it had taken everything I had to pull it off. And I'd lost about 30 pounds. I was so skinny, I could pinch my fingers around my biceps. That's me in the yellow shirt with my climbing partner, Chris. And on the summit day, it had been really cold, kind of like it isn't Boulder for you guys today, but it was actually 40 below zero that day. We left our summit camp, and my fingers got frostbitten a little bit, but fortunately, nothing had to be amputated. And we pulled it off. We made the third ascent of K2, first ascent ever without using oxygen. And we climbed it by a new route, the Northeast Ridge, which nobody's ever repeated all these years later. So I was back in the game. And the next year in 1980, I was invited to the People's Republic. In the first year, China opened to foreign mountaineers, and I was part of a team that included Yvonne Chouinard, who by that time was not just my climbing partner, but one of my best friends. And we were going to this region in eastern Tibet that no Westerner had seen in 50 years to attempt a 25,000 foot peak called Minyakonka. And that had only been climbed twice ever. And it was my kind of a trip to a super remote region, hardly explored at all, with a good team of close friends. And it included one named Jonathan Wright, who was also my business partner, because we were a writer photographer team. And things were going okay until one day at about 20,000 feet, we got caught in an avalanche, just swept down the mountain for over 1,500 vertical feet. And I was just sure there was no way I was going to get out of this one alive. And then the snow slowed and finally stopped. And I was hurt. And so was everybody else. But none of us as badly as Jonathan. And I tried to keep him alive, holding him in my arms, giving him mouth to mouth. But after a half hour, he died while I was holding him. And the next day we buried him under a mound of rocks next to where he died. And we went home, and I went into a deep introspection about whether I should continue to climb. And I just didn't know if I could. It took me a couple of years to think it through, to think about what I'd learned, what I'd taken from the high elevations and brought down to my life at sea level. And I thought about how you learn on a climb to make a plan, but how inevitably stuff goes wrong and you have to learn to be flexible and adjust. And I thought about tenacity and how on a mountain like K2, you get to the top one step at a time. And maybe the most important lesson, and it's one that was easiest to ignore because it seems the most banal, but I think it's actually the hardest to learn because it's just so omnipresent. And that's how I learned over the years that, the real goal isn't the summit, but it's really the process, the footsteps that it takes to get there. And those were some of the lessons that I'd learned over those years. But after the avalanche, after Jonathan had died, and for a full minute, 60 long seconds, I thought I was going to die. I had changed, and I just wasn't the same person. Sometimes I was waking up, just amazed that I was still alive. And I remember one day, for example, I was walking from my car into my office, and I just stopped in the parking lot and stood there to feel the difference between the side of my face that was in sunshine and the other side that was in shadow. And in a way, it was feeling like I'd been reborn with this kind of new awareness about how to pay attention to simple stuff that wasn't that simple at all. And I started to realize how quickly any of us cannot be alive. And a few years later, I ran into a poem, that famous one by Mary Oliver called Summer's Day, with that famous last line that summarized my challenge when she said, tell me what you plan to do with your one wild and precious life. And that's what it was. A challenge that included the decision whether I was going to go back to climbing. But meanwhile, I had my professional life, and I was a writer and filmmaker and a photographer. And Jonathan's family asked me to complete a story for National Geographic that he and I had been working on about what back then was the newly chartered Mount Everest National Park. And I decided to do it for them, for Jonathan and his wife and the baby daughter, 1 year old, that Jonathan had left behind when he died. So I went back to Kathmandu, and I was in the bar at the Yak and Yeti when I saw this woman in the lobby, and I had to wait her cinder a drink, which is really untypical of me. I just not forward that way, but for some reason I did. And we started talking, and she wanted to know where I lived. And I said I had this little beach cottage just south of Santa Barbara, when the reality was I lived in a surfer shack on a low rent beach just north of Oxnard, but the line worked. And about a year later, Jennifer and I were married. And I'd come to realize that it wasn't a coincidence that I made the shift in my life so soon after Jonathan had died in my arms, and so soon after I'd nearly died myself. And it wasn't a chance that Jennifer and I started our family right away, but that made it even more difficult to decide whether to return to mountaineering, but mountaineering was what I did, and so much of who I had become was from my time in the mountains, my time in nature. And even with the family, I was still wrestling whether the rewards outweighed the risks. What if the right people with the right project came along? Would I think about going back, and what would Jennifer think? Well, then it happened when I got a call from these two guys, Frank Wells on the right, who was the president of Warner Brothers at the time, and Dick Bass, who owned the Snowbird Ski Resort. And by coincidence, they had both learned that they shared a lifelong dream to climb the highest mountain on each of the 7 continents. And they didn't have very much climbing experience, and they were both nearly 50 years old, and they would need guides to help organize the trips. And they invited me to come along on any of the climbs I wanted to join. So I asked Jennifer, and she said, maybe the bigger risk, Rick, is not going, not staying true to who you are, and maybe just as importantly, not meeting new people. And she told me that even though, I was going to be guiding Frank and Dick, that maybe they could in turn guide me in a sense. Well, it wasn't the first time I would realize that, in a marriage, 2 + 2 can add up to a lot more than or 1 + 1 can add up to a lot more than 2. And I decided to go on 3 of the 7 summit expeditions, starting with Aconcagua, the highest peak in South America. And we all got to the top, including Yvonne, who was also on the trip. And from there, I went on to Everest, but this time, instead of a guide, I had a new role that I'd never done before. I was the color commentator on a ABC television special that was made of the expedition, which was successful. Several guys got to the top, but not Frank or Dick. Although Dick really came close. He got all the way up to the 28,000 foot level before his climbing partner turned around. But those two guys went on to climb the highest peak in North America and Africa and Australia. And here they are on top of Mount Elbrus and in Europe. And then the last on the list was the Vinson Massif, the highest peak in Antarctica. And I joined again as a guide, and we were the first private expedition ever to reach the interior of Antarctica in that old retrofitted DC-3, the so-called tri-turbo. And we all got to the top on this one. This is a picture of me on the summit, which was only the third ascent ever of Vinson. But Frank and Dick had missed Everest, like I said. And even though Frank had to go back to work, this time as the president of Disney, Dick went back to Everest, got turned back again, went back again the third time. And at 55 years old, he got to the summit and became the first guy to climb the 7 summits. And back at base camp, he called me on the radio in his hoarse voice. And I'll never forget him saying, "Rick, it just goes to show you that the second half," and I knew that was his shorthand for life after 50. He said, "The second half can be and should be the best half." So my wife was right. I wasn't guiding Dick and Frank as much as they were guiding and inspiring me with a new confidence to live my life in wild places, the wildest places in the world, but also to commit to being there for my family between the trips. And I'm not going to pretend that wasn't hard and wasn't without friction, but Jennifer and I made it work because, well, filming and photography and writing about living life wild is how I made my living. And it wasn't just in the mountains either, but it was in jungles like this trip where we made first crossing of Borneo at its widest point. 800 miles as the hornbill flew, but I think counting all the wines and bins, it was over 2,000 miles. And then on another jungle adventure, our objective was this secluded granite spire that rose 2,000 feet out of the Amazon. In a region of the jungle, it was 80 miles past the last Yanomami village. And that was a village that had been visited by anthropologists only in the previous decade. And we hired several Yanomami to help us carry gear. And one day, one of them dropped his pack and headed into the forest. And I followed him, realizing he heard a troop of monkeys. And then he stopped, and from a distance, I saw him calling to make the monkeys curious. And sure enough, they came in for a closer look. And then he drew his arrow and shot and missed. But the image was stuck in my head. It was like a song that you can't get rid of. And finally, I realized what it was. It was that I was looking at this image of a man who was just like I used to be. And there were more adventures, including one climbing Kilimanjaro. But the summit was where this trip only started, because from the top, we walked 500 kilometers due east, all the way to the Indian Ocean, crossing the bushlands of the Twin Savo National Parks, together the size of Israel. And it was a 500-kilometer walk, and on foot and eye level the whole way, with critters that put us a few rungs down the food chain. And I reflected on conservation efforts around the world to save wildlands and wildlife on this trip. And that led to an expedition that used my outdoor skills to help save a species called the sheru, an antelope-looking creature that's actually a goat that lives in the most remote margins of northwest Tibet. And the animals were in danger because poachers were killing them for their fur that was woven into expensive shawls that had become fashion hits. And biologists were concerned that if the poachers discovered the sheru's calving grounds, it would be game over for this endangered species. Because each summer the females migrated to an unknown place where they had their babies, and the biologists needed to discover where it was so that they could persuade the Chinese to protect it. But but it was in an area that was completely uninhabited, and none of them could get there. But what if I got some of my climbing buddies and I followed the migration on foot, carrying our supplies in custom-made rickshaws because we had too much just to backpack? Well, we had to walk about 300 miles, and at the start, each of our carts weighed 275 pounds, and the average elevation for the whole way was about 16,000 feet. And after a couple of weeks of more calories going out than in, even Conrad Ankner, who, as you guys know, is one of the toughest climbers in the world, was feeling it. But finally, after 3 weeks, we found this high snow-dusted plateau with thousands of Shiru congregating in a place where nobody could bother them to have their babies safely. And we documented the calving grounds, and we wrote an article and made a movie for National Geographic, and the publicity convinced the Chinese to create a protected area around the calving grounds. And since then, the Shiru have been increasing, and the conservation of wildlife and wildlands after this was becoming increasingly important to me, and in large part too, because of what I was learning from two of my frequent companions on many of my trips, Yvonne Chouinard on the right and Doug Tompkins. And these two guys have been close friends and climbing partners since the early 1960s. And they had also started iconic climbing and outdoor equipment companies, as I think most of you know, Doug making sleeping bags and packs and later parkas and jackets. And he had named his company the North Face. And a few years later, Yvonne started his own company and called it Patagonia, a name he'd given the company because of an adventure that he and Doug had made when they're both still in their 20s. And that trip had a huge influence on them. And that in turn had a huge ripple effect on me and my generation, and even subsequent generations of climbers. And I'll let Yvonne and Doug tell you just a bit about the trip in this video clip.
And picked up a 16mm Bolex camera to record the trip. Loaded the car up with surfboards and climbing gear and took off for a 10,000-mile trip down south. I think from the time we decided to go was like 2 weeks before we went. We bought this old van and took off from Ventura. 1968, you gotta remember the Pan American Highway was pretty wild. It was dirt road from Mexico City all the way south. It was like being in Montana or Wyoming 100 years ago. Here we're in an area that's the size of the whole American West, with no people.
For those of us that grew up going out into the wilds of the world, where nature was basically untouched, we got into our souls a sense of beauty.
That trip had a big influence on both Doug and I. It kind of set the course for what we were going to do later in life. For me, it was the best trip of my life.
Well, when they got back from that trip, Doug sold the North Face and partnered with his wife, Susie, to start a women's wear company that they called Esprit. And the two of them built it into $1 billion brand. But Doug was increasingly disillusioned with making a lot of stuff that he realized nobody really needed. And when his marriage fell apart, he sold his half and he moved to a remote part of southern Chile, and he started buying wildlands to convert them into national parks. And then he fell in love with a woman named Chris McDivitt, and Chris ran Yvonne's company, Patagonia. That's her on the right. And she was also one of my very best friends. So she left Patagonia, the company, and moved to Patagonia, the place, to join Doug. And the two of them would go on over the next 25 years to create over 16 million acres of new national parks in Chile and Argentina. And it was the biggest conservation win by private individuals in the history of conservation. And I was privileged to have a part in the effort from the beginning. And I was also fortunate to have a chance in about the same time to join Yvonne's company, Patagonia. And like my mentors, Doug and Yvonne, apply what I'd learned from years in nature as a climber and explorer to the way we ran the company, because fundamentally the company is in business to use business as an agent for environmental protection. Because as Yvonne says, if we don't save our home planet, there's not going to be a planet for any business. And I got to work at Patagonia with just terrific people, all committed to the same higher calling. And those people included interns that joined the company every summer to fill about a dozen positions from a pool of over 10,000 applicants. And it made it harder to get into a Patagonia internship than it is to get into Harvard. And one year, the interns included a young woman who was an active outdoor athlete who at that time had just turned 20 years old, but she had been barely a year old when her father, Jonathan, had died in my arms after that avalanche in Tibet. And Jonathan had named her Asia after his favorite place in the world. And after we buried him in that remote grave, Yvonne and I had stayed in touch. And we saw Asia every couple of years as she grew up, kind of trying to be little part-time fill-in fathers. And now she was an intern. And I knew before the summer was over, she was going to want to know about her father, because her mother, after he died, had shut him out of their memory. And sure enough, Asia asked me if we could have a chat, and I didn't hold back. I told her about her father, about the avalanche, about how I'd held him, giving him mouth to mouth, trying to keep him alive. And she thanked me and then said, that wasn't why she wanted to talk to me. She said that she had a favor, and she wanted me to take her back to the mountain, back to Minnetonka, where her father had died, to climb the flank and find his grave. And I told her I need to think about that. I went to my wife and asked her what she thought, and Jennifer said, well, of course you're going, because Asia's not asking you just to find her father. She's asking you to be your father. And I knew that if Jonathan had lived, he would have taken his daughter on some of his trips. And certainly those trips would have included Asia, the place. So that's what Asia and I did. We journeyed to the Everest region, where I had a lot of Sherpa friends who had been Jonathan's friends, and now they were Asia's friends. And we ventured to Western Tibet, into mountains that had hardly been explored. And we had to endure 60-mile-an-hour winds to climb a 21,000-foot peak that was unnamed, and at least until that day, completely unclimbed. And then in Eastern Tibet, we approached the flank of Minnetonka, where her father died. And it had been 20 years, and I wasn't sure I could find the grave. But finally, on a high, barren buttress, we did find it, only it had been disturbed, probably by a snow leopard. So Asia and I, we gathered my old friend's bones, the two of us, and we reburied him and strung fresh prayer flags over the grave, and said our own prayers and made our own thanksgivings, and we started the long journey home. And the full trip, it was really a pilgrimage. The full pilgrimage took 2 months. And in that time, I shared with Asia the stories and the lessons of those stories that I knew her father would have shared with her. And there are many of the same lessons that I shared with you tonight, about how you have to plan, but know that stuff happens, so you need to change or adjust your plan. How you get to the top one step at a time. How you need to go about your life, knowing that it's not about the summit, but it's really about the footsteps. That it's about the way you get there. That in your work life, as well as your home life, your life has to have a purpose. And that purpose needs to be more than just about you, but about how you can be more than just yourself. So knowing what you know, I think I'll challenge all of us the same way those years before. I challenge myself to tell me what it is you plan to do with your one wild and precious life. So thank you, guys.
Well, Rick, thanks so much. At this point, I'd like to open it to questions from anyone. Just make sure you unmute yourself when you ask about that. I would kick it off by asking about the Thompson Conservation Lands in South America. What's the status of that? Is it well protected? Has it been threatened by damming? Or?
Yeah, they've after, I didn't get to cover all the stories that are again in the book. The book really ends with one of my last trips, Doug Tompkins, when we were kayaking down in Patagonia, and we got into a really tough crosswind, kind of unpredictable, and the rudder on our kayak failed, and we capsized, and the water was cold. It's 39 degrees, and by the time my buddies who were with us got me ashore, I was unconscious from hypothermia, and Doug was unconscious, and I lived, and he didn't recover. So Chris and my wife, she threw Chris a life ring. I don't think Chris would have figured out how to pull through this without Jennifer. And Chris rallied, and she got out of her black dress and put on her work dress, rolled up her sleeves, and finished the job. And the final count was 8 new national parks that didn't exist before, for actually now 18 million acres in total between Chile and Argentina, where the countries are doing a good job of managing them. They are, and we've really worked to support the two countries with Friends of the Park organizations to help fund the maintenance of these parks. But as I said briefly in my slideshow, it's the biggest conservation win ever by individuals. So yeah, that story's the end of my book.
Any other questions for
Rick? I heard there was a film in the works on the conservation of Patagonia.
Yeah, my good buddy Jimmy Chin. That rickshaw trip where we pulled those carts across Northwest Tibet to try and save those Shiru.
Yeah.
We needed, Dave Brashears was going to come along to film it. We're making a movie for National Geographic, and he dropped out the last minute. So Conrad said, "Hey, I met this young kid named Jimmy Chin, and I really like him. He's got a great smile, and he's tough as nails." So I called up Jimmy, and he'd never, he was trying to be a photographer, but he never made a movie before. I told him, "Well, listen, I'll show you how to work a camera." And he goes, "Oh God, I've never shot film. I don't know if I can do it." And I said, "Jimmy, commit and then figure it out." So he did. And when we started off on the trip, when he got invited, he told me later, as he was thinking to himself after I convinced him to go, he said, "God, what did I do to deserve this?" And then he told me about a week into the trip, he said, "What did I do to deserve this?" But the film was really successful. It was Jimmy's first movie, and it really helped mentor him along. So now, he's won an Oscar, and he's got all these famous documentaries out, but his next big one's going to be about Chris. It comes out later this year.
That's great. I'm glad to hear that. He and his wife are a terrific team.
Yeah.
And do you have any other climbs planned for your?
No, but this book I wouldn't have written this book without Jimmy, because we were coming back from Patagonia, Jimmy and me, where we'd been down there filming Chris for his movie that's about to come out. And we're in the bar there in Santiago, and we got like this long layover between the internal flight and the international flight home, 7 hours. So, you know, we're in the bar drinking our beers, and I just started telling stories like the K2 story, and Jimmy's going, "Whoa, dude," he says, "you got to have an Instagram account." So by the time we had our third beer, I'd had this Instagram account that Jimmy started for me, and we'd started posting some old photographs I had, and I started getting these followers. I didn't even know what a follower was. And then one of them was my daughter. And finally, she said, "You know, you got to turn this into a book. This is really cool." So that's where the idea came from. Originally, it was like 50 stories, but I realized that was way too many. It was a doorstop. It wasn't a book. So I edited it down and into what it is now. But again, I wouldn't have written the book without Jimmy giving me the impetus indirectly to start it.
Well, Rick, this is Tiff. You wouldn't probably remember me, but I want to thank you very much, or maybe thank Jimmy. I was Dick Bass's actor a little bit.
Oh my goodness.
And I sent you an email earlier today. After I'm only to the chapter after Borneo and Bridwell. But it's just been terrific to relive a lot of really fond memories from my time when I was there with Dick in 84 and 85 at only base camp. I'm no big climber. So you'll have to check my email, but thanks very much.
Oh, you're welcome, Kef. And if you've spent that much time with Dick, you got enough stories to write your own book.
Well, I told you a couple. I don't know. You probably know them already, but not to be shared here.
I'm looking forward to that.
Okay. Thanks again.
My pleasure.
Rick, I have a question.
Yeah, please, Jim.
Yeah, Jim Davidson here. You know, you live this amazing life of adventures with all these amazing folks, and other folks, you know, do their own adventures. What do you think the average person in America or around the world needs to hear from someone like yourself and other explorers in their group here? What do they need to hear to help them get through their daily challenges?
To get out into nature and learn how nature in the wild world really works. And then to bring those learnings back home and apply them, you know, to their lives openly and honestly. I think if we had more people out in nature and learning how the world really works, we would all be more committed to finding solutions to the two existential crises of our times, the interlinked crises of climate and extinction. So that's my message when I go out there on the road and people want to know what the secret sauce is. And of course, there's never any secret sauce, but if you spend enough time in nature, you do get some of those secrets revealed about how best any of us could live our lives. And that's how I've done it. That's how just about all my friends have done it. And that's my recommendation to everyone. And I encourage all of you here to do that, of course, ourselves.
Great, thanks, Rick.
Well, we have time for one more question. If not,
I'll ask one.
yeah.
In your time in photography, did you ever run into Galen Rowell and have much to do with Galen?
Yeah, Galen was the fourth member of our trip across Northwest Tibet pulling those rickshaws, and he took all the photographs that were in the book I wrote, and he illustrated, and the magazine article that we all did together. And I was home that summer, Merrill, about 3 weeks after our trip when David Brashears called me, and it was my birthday, and my wife, I was down at the patio with all my buddies around this big birthday celebration, and she called out, she said, "Rick, you got a phone call." And I said, "No, tell him I'll call back." She says, no, David wants to talk to you. And I knew somebody had died. That's all I needed to know. So I picked up the phone, and instead of just saying, "Hi, David," I said, "David, who's dead?" And he said, "Galen." Yeah, that's That's how I got the news. But you know, Meryl, about a week after we got back from that trip, we all got together at Galen's house in Bishop with our mentor who had inspired the trip, George Schaller, that conservation biologist. And we were working for George on that trip. We all had jobs assigned to us by him. So we shared all of our data with him. And then he, of course, was curious about how the trip went because he knew that region so well. Not the center of where we crossed an area that was about 50 miles wide. And George had tracked every single explorer who had crossed that part of Tibet on a map, a very accurate map. He'd drawn each route out, including his own. And there was this section in the middle about 50 or 60 miles across. No outsider had ever seen that ever before. And as I told you briefly, you know, when we got back, what I didn't say was how George took all this media that we created. He went back to China and convinced the Chinese to create a protected area around the calving grounds. And then we all raised some money to help the Chinese patrol it with field patrols, and it worked, kept the poachers out, and it reversed the decline of those animals, which today are actually recovering. And when we're back at Galen's house, he looked at George and the rest of us. He said, you know, you guys know I've been doing this my whole life, but this by far was the most fulfilling expedition I've ever had. So I found a lot of comfort in that, knowing that we were together on what his last trip was, that he also considered his most fulfilling trip.
He was my inspiration in outdoor photography, and I visited that gallery in Bishop before he died, actually. No, right after he died. Yeah.
Well, you know, Jeff, I'm gonna be in New York at the club meeting. So if any of you guys are coming, I'll get to see you in person there next. So, yeah.
Yeah, great.
I see George waving his arms. So
That means you're coming to New York, George?
Yeah.
You'll be there. Great.
Watching in Greenland, and I'll get back from that, and 5 days later, I'll be in New York.
Excellent. Good. Well, everybody, thanks for joining us with Rick. Rick, you're quite the inspiration, and we all wish you great success with the book.
Thank you for having me on this evening. Pleasure to share it with you guys.
And have
Thanks.
Stephanie let
It
us
was really great.
have Stephanie let us know when you're going to be in Boulder too.
Okay, yeah, we'll do.
In person.
Sometime in May. I'll let her make sure she does that. Great.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Rick.
See you next month.
Good evening.
Take care. Okay, I think we did it. And Kit, you're still there?
Yeah, can I record it now this late or no?